All right, good morning, everyone. If you would go ahead and take a seat, please. All right, good morning. My name is Dr. Rachel Gould, and I'm an English professor, an assistant professor of English in the Hute Division here at Seaver, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our fall gathering of our Hute Symposium. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to make sure that I took a minute to thank the Pepperdine Libraries because they partnered with us, particularly Dean Rusa and Jeff Bowen, for helping us get all of this set up. So thank you so much for all of the ways that you all support faculty research. We're very grateful. I am delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Lisa Smith. Dr. Smith earned her PhD in early American literature at the University of Delaware, and she has been part of the Pepperdine community since 2006. Her research focuses on the First Great Awakening, and her first book, The First Great Awakening in Colonial American Newspapers, A Shifting Story, examines the ways that colonial information networks contributed to and helped spread the Great Awakening through the newspaper's weekly reports on revivals, preachers, and congregations. Dr. Smith's passion for this subject informs her work in the classroom as well here at Seaver, where she teaches courses on gender and spirituality in early American literature. Her new work, Hammer and Fire, Lessons on Spiritual Passion from the Writings and Life of George Whitefield, emerged from her work as an educator as she began to ask what insights she, as an academic, could bring to George Whitefield's writings about faith for a non-academic audience. Today, she will be sharing these insights from her new project, and there will be time for questions and refreshments following. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Smith.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Thank you, Rachel, for that very kind introduction. Thanks for running the symposium this year. I want to also thank our divisional dean, Stella Erbs, in the back for providing the food, and Lee Jackson, thanks for your work with that. And of course, Jeff Bowen and Pepperdine Libraries for partnering with us and offering the surfboard room, because when you can do this in a room full of surfboards, that's kind of what you want to do. And thank you guys for coming out. I know, is this too loud? Are you guys, you're hearing me okay? I know it's a busy kickoff of the year, so thanks very much for coming out. I want to talk about my new book that's coming out in a couple months, pre-order available on Amazon. The title, as Rachel said, is Hammer and Fire, Lessons on Spiritual Passion from the Writings and Life of George Whitefield. And my thinking in this book was to kind of look at exactly that, the life of Whitefield. He was an 18th century revivalist who had a very intense and impactful life, very innovative in a lot of the things that he did, very well known. So I wanted to look at his life, and I also wanted to look at his writings. Rachel also mentioned that I teach classes in this area and in this subject, and when I read his writings, his passion and his excitement for what he's doing really comes through. So I thought to myself, is there a way I can bring maybe some of the best incidents of his life and some of the best excerpts of his writing to a modern reading public, not just as information, but really for kind of inspiration and for, honestly, lessons. What can we learn from him for our own spiritual journey? Because he was a man who sustained his spiritual journey for 30 years, made a big impact in the world. What can we learn from him? So that was kind of my thinking. So this talk today is not going to be so much about the content. It's actually, I wanted to make it more about what I was hoping, or what I am hoping, the book will do as a public humanities project, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. But some of you have already worked in that area, I know, and so I thought it would be interesting, more talk about that than actually just what's inside the book, although what's inside the book is, super fun too. Anyway, yeah, I will do maybe like 35 minutes or so for things I want to share, and then leave some time for questions, or as we go along, if you have things you want to say. So as far as content, the book has two main pieces of content. One is Whitefield and his life, lived through much of the 18th century. If you know him, he was an English Anglican itinerant minister. Sorry, I'm just realizing I don't see a clock here. There. English itinerant minister, meaning he was English. He was ordained in the Church of England, Anglican Church, called Episcopal Church in America, and he was an itinerant pastor, so he didn't have one settled parish or church. he traveled around and preached in a lot of different places, which was kind of unique for the time. He was famous for his preaching. He had done some work or training as an actor, and when he became a Christian, he transferred some of that to the pulpit. But he was very innovative. He preached outdoors before people did. He was very dramatic. Instead of just getting up and reading his sermon, he would tell stories and ask questions of the audience, sometimes burst into tears. You know, I could try that on this. Burst into tears just in the middle of his sermon. So he was really entertaining, along with being very effective in his preaching. So he became very famous for that. He was honestly a kind of international celebrity in the West, in the American colonies. He made 7 trips to the colonies. He traveled a lot throughout Great Britain. So he was very well known. People said, if you hear the name George, you either think of the English king or you think of Whitefield. And he was one of the leaders of the First Great Awakening, which was a religious revival in the 1740s that I'll talk about in a second. Why I thought he would be a good subject for a book on kind of spiritual zeal and kind of desire to serve God and to bless others is mainly because of what people said about him in his day. Mr. Whitefield's eloquence is unrivaled, his zeal inexhaustible. That's what one contemporary said. He's the most extraordinary man in our times. He has the most commanding eloquence I ever heard in any person. His abilities are very considerable. His zeal unquenchable. His integrity and indefatigable zeal in accomplishing every good work I have never seen equaled. I have never seen exceeded. That's from Benjamin Franklin. So he was known in his day for doing something special and for being a man who was trying to do something different. The other kind of content piece in the book is the First Great Awakening, which was a religious revival. I picked those dates. It's around there. It was in Great Britain. It was also in America. And it intersected with Whitefield very dramatically. As far as the revival itself, it had a unique for the time focus on what was called the spiritual new birth, taken from John 3, when Jesus said to Nicodemus, you have to be born again to enter the kingdom of heaven. So one thing the revivalists were trying to do was share this idea that Christianity and spirituality is not so much doing things, going to church, being confirmed, taking communion. It's more having an actual conversion experience where you now decide to follow Jesus. You now decide to live your life the way that he would want you to live it and in relationship with him. So that was kind of a dramatic message for the time. In America, it was primarily among Protestant Calvinist dissenters, so people who dissented from or kind of disagreed with the Church of England. It was very dramatic and powerful. If you've studied it at all, particularly in the American colony, in the English colonies in America, there were lots of church splits. There were lots of newspaper articles back and forth, lots of writing on it, lots of people weighing in on it from the pulpit. So it really affected a lot of the colonies, all of the colonies, and it was very controversial. People wondered, was this a good idea? Why are people now suddenly having church meetings every day? Why are so many people being converted and joining the church? Why are people walking down the street singing? So it was very impactful, and it's considered to be really the first kind of intercolonial event, because this is 20 years before the Stamp Act, this is 30 years before the Revolution, so this even before the French and Indian War. So this is the first event that really all the colonies kind of were aware of and participated in. And part of that is because of Whitefield. He came in 1739 in October, landed in Lewis, Delaware, my home state, I might say. Michael, I know it was part of Pennsylvania then. Don't yell at me, okay? It's just, I get that. He came for 15 months, and he went up and down all of the colonies, as far south as Georgia and as far north as York, Maine. So he intersected with the First Great Awakening very intensely. He was seen as one of the leaders, and he really kind of broadcast it to a lot of the colonies. And he also did a lot of writing, especially at that time in his life. He published sermons, as many ministers did at the time. He published a lot of personal letters. We have at least 2,000 of his letters. He kept up with his really international network. He kept up with them through writing. And then he published journals. Now, he knew they were for publication, but he wrote them in a very personal style, which was also something kind of unique for a minister of the day. So as he would travel, particularly in the American colonies, he would write about what his preaching was like that day, how it was received, what he thought about it. He would talk about his own private times with God. He would talk about times the Holy Spirit challenged him to pick a different passage to preach from than the one he had prepared. So they kind of allowed a real intimate glimpse into his spirituality and into his ministry, which wasn't really common at the time. He published 7 of them in just a handful of years early in his ministry. So I looked at this and I thought, well, if I want to write about the First Great Awakening and I want to bring in Whitefield, I want to bring some of his life in, I want to bring some of his writing in, and I want it to be something that will captivate Christians and inspire Christians, my question then was, well, what kind of book should I write? And that's kind of what I want to make this talk about. And many of you have experience with exactly what I'm going to share here, different ways into a topic and different readers that it appeals to. I could certainly do an academic book, right? I mean, I've done some of that. I did an academic monograph on the First Great Awakening. There are academic books on Whitefield, right? I could join in on that. But I didn't think that was quite the way I wanted to go. I had also in recent years gotten very interested in pedagogy. And you all know what I'm talking about when a big part of our job is taking ideas and materials and topics and events that maybe our audience doesn't have an intense interest in and making it interesting to them, right? Many of us here, many educators, we do real deep dive into our field, but we have to get good at bringing that to an audience that doesn't have as much of the background as we do. So I was like, well, maybe I should do something like that with Whitefield. I know a lot about him, I know a lot about the First Great Awakening, but maybe I should put kind of the educator hat on and think about how I could bring this stuff to an audience that might not even know they want to read it. And then lastly, I have recently done some writing that might be classified as devotional or Christian living, where I just wrote sort of a straight trade book, not academic really at all, on women in the Bible. I tried to bring my kind of understanding as an English professor to the stories, the narratives in the Bible. So all that was kind of swirling around in my head, and I'm like, well, what direction should I really go with the stuff that I want to talk about? So I thought, could I create a hybrid? Could I take, there you are, could I take kind of my scholar hat, right? What I do as a professor? Could I add what I do in the classroom? And also add what I've done in other Christian settings. Photo credit to Laura for that. Either when I've written online or when I've presented at other Christian settings. Could I kind of put that together and create a book that was kind of a hybrid? And that's what I tried to do. Time will tell if it worked. But it's not out yet. But at least I put it together and someone published it. So I figure that's something. So that's kind of what I want to talk about today, is I want to tell you what I tried to do with this book, just in terms of the structure and who it's appealing to and what I hope I brought to it as an academic, and then would love to have your input, because like I said, I know some of you have done this exact same thing with some of your writing, and we all do it in the classroom or in other places. So this is the book. It's coming out from a small publisher, a small Christian publisher out of Baltimore. They've been around about 20, 25 years, called Square Halo Books. It is designed for a general Christian readership. So it is not designed just for an academic readership. It's designed for someone who might know zero about Whitefield or the First Great Awakening when they pick up the book. My goal is to inspire and inform readers for their own spiritual journey. So that was very much in my head. It's really not just a teaching assignment where I just want to download for them a bunch of information about Whitefield and his life and his writings. But I really am hoping that as people read it, if they do have their own spiritual journey, they will be encouraged in it and they will learn things from Whitefield. I'm calling it a public humanities project because it sounded cool, but also I thought, what can I offer as an academic scholar, right? Really, that's kind of my question. And this is a pretty big topic right now. Many of you have looked at the public humanities kind of surge in the last decade or so, where people are saying, hey, let's get out of our ivory tower and let's share some of the knowledge we have, the training we have. Let's start bringing this to a general readership. This is a statement from the Modern Language Association Committee on Public Humanities just a year ago. At a time of increased anxiety over the value of the humanities, public humanities scholarship that engages multiple and diverse audiences beyond the university in literature, modern languages, translation and interpretation studies, history, the arts, and cultural heritage has the potential to demonstrate the powerful impact of the humanities in the world. So that was in my mind as I went into this. How can I really keep that kind of a reader in mind? Well, I said to myself, what can I kind of contribute, right? What could I offer as an academic scholar? And if you think about it for a minute, those of you who have done these projects, or why would you pick up a book by an academic as opposed to maybe a journalist or someone else? There are certain things you're probably looking for in that book, right? Certain things that I'm hoping I can bring to it. First of all, hard to access writings. A lot of Whitefield's writings that are circulating now in print form or on the internet are revised editions. He was very aware of his brand, so he edited and revised a lot of his writings. His friends, as was typical for that time and other times, took some of his writings and changed them up. I was like, you know what? I'm gonna get the first editions. I'm gonna get the fresh stuff, like before he realized he should pull things back. Right, so I was able to do that, of course, through the databases. Thank you, librarians, for the help. So I was hoping to bring that to the book. Also, of course, archival research, and awareness of maybe finding some other letters, other places, things like that. I was hoping to bring that as a scholar. But at the same time, I was hoping to bring a broad understanding of life events, his life events, and the time. I mean, that's what we hope for, I think, in this setting, is we're doing a deep dive, of course, in our field, but we also are hoping that we can read widely enough and take in enough other ideas that we can have kind of the big picture when we come to some of these topics. So I was hoping to do that. I mean, I'm a writing teacher too. I'm hoping it's clear, engaging writing. And if any of you have ever switched from academic writing to more like trade writing, it's hard. I had to do it for my book, Godly Characters, and I remember I wrote what I thought was the greatest intro known to man. And I showed it to my reader who had some familiarity in writing more like trade-like books, and she was like, yeah, this is the worst thing I've ever read. And I was like, it's beautiful. Like, I'm sleeping with it under my pillow. It's amazing. And she's like, well, I don't know anything about you. I don't know why you're writing this book. I'm like, what does that matter? Here's the content. She's like, yeah, no, you don't know anything, do you? So she took me under her wing and helped me. So with this book, I wanted the same thing. I wanted to write in a way that made people engaged. And I did kind of want to keep my teacher hat on. I mean, none of us in the classroom wants to just download information or transfer information to people, right? I mean, Anastasia, you want somebody to leave that special collections classroom loving old books, right? So we want them to be inspired. We want them to apply things. And so that's what I was actually hoping with this book. I was like, how can I write in such a way that it's almost like I'm just kind of leading the reader along to consider some of these different thoughts. And then I really wanted to engage Whitefield's successes and failures. Academic books looked at that, but a lot of the books written by Christians for a Christian audience tended to highlight just his successes. And it was important to me to kind of look at both because he was human and he had failures also, like we all do. And it was also important to my publisher. So that's kind of what I tried to talk about. So that was my game plan. The topics I thought would be interesting, and I want to basically show you the three pieces of the book. I want to show you the topics I wanted to talk about, I did try to talk about in the book. I want to show you some of the life events, and then some of the writings that I brought in, show you how I put those all together, and then get some input from you guys on that. So I had 8 topics around this idea of spiritual zeal or passion for God, or just a desire to really serve God and really serve others. And I tried to choose topics that kind of built. So the first 4 chapters have to do with us personally, spiritually. How do we ignite that fire, that passion for God? How do we embrace meaning? How do we build a foundation? And then how do we develop a lifestyle that reflects that passion. And then the next 4 chapters look at kind of how we interact with others. How can we share that journey, that spiritual journey, with others? How do we respond when people push back against us and what we're doing, feel like we're doing spiritually? How do we respond to culture? Because we're not islands, right? We have people around us. And then how do we sustain that fire? We all know, anybody over the age of 20, I don't know, 15, it's hard to do things for a long time, right? You can be great on something for a short time, but to do it for a long time can be hard. So I wanted to finish with that. So those, in terms of sort of spiritual formation ideas, those are the topics that I wanted to look at in the book. As far as Whitefield's life events, I have a handful of different ones. Things like his conversion, I thought was really interesting. He went hard at it, like no joke, trying to convert. He was fasting and, wearing terrible clothes. He ended up being ill, had to go home. Like, he went hard at it, so I thought that would be interesting to look at. His ordination also, he gave a lot of thought to if he wanted to be a minister, what kind of minister he wanted to be, was he ready? So impactful was this time for him that in his last sermon before he left England, right before he died, he actually referenced that time as being something that he took very seriously. It might be weird to have sea voyages to and from America on there, but I found them with Whitefield to be kind of interesting little interludes between all of his ministry. It took anywhere from 6 weeks to, for one of his voyages, 11 weeks. So that's a long time to kind of be suspended and to kind of, be between the things that you're anticipating. So he really used those times, and I thought they would be interesting to look at. He journaled a lot during that and had some real goals for his sea voyages. Preaching experiences, I had to look at those because, he was drawing 20,000 people at Boston Common when Boston was only 17,000 people. He was just really drawing these huge numbers. If you're familiar with Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, there's a section in there where he walks off to try to estimate based on, how many feet each person needed, how many he could actually be heard by. So I wanted to talk about his preaching experiences. I wanted to talk about his connections with American revivalists, like Jonathan Edwards. He was great at networking. I'm sorry he's not here, because I would have the Career Center bring him in for how to network, because he was incredible at making connections and maintaining them. And he had a lot of opposition. He had to learn early in life. His first preaching tour, he was 24 years old when he came over here in 1739. So he had to learn pretty early. It's not too far away, right? So he had to learn early in life what to do with people who pushed back against what he really felt was his calling and his passion and what God had asked him to do. So those are the life events. Some of his writings that I tried to include, he has a couple autobiographies. He wrote one before he was 25, so I don't know what that says. He was confident that he was going to be important. So his autobiographies, I wanted to include some of his sermons. Not the whole sermon, okay, all of these are excerpts. But he was well known for his preaching, so I wanted to include some of his sermons. I wanted to bring in things from his journals, his personal writings, and his personal letters. So that's what I was hoping to do, and here was my crazy idea. I thought I could do all of this. Sorry, this little clicker's hard. I wanted to do spiritual formation stuff, so I wanted to talk about the topic in each chapter. I wanted to have a life event in each chapter and have them go chronologically with the focus on his early life. And then I wanted to include a writing in each chapter that matched that life event and the topic. That's why I don't know if it worked, but we'll see. Okay, so that's what I was trying to do, is kind of bring all those different sources. And then the overlay is just what are the lessons we're learning from that. Some of the challenges you guys can probably guess what some of them were. In fact, some of you have probably faced them either in the classroom or in writing. Some of the things I was worried about, bringing all that together, that's a lot to cram into each chapter. Conciseness in summarizing life events. John, I'm not a creative writer, like telling a story, like you can get lost in it, especially if it's a reader that you think doesn't really know the background. So I'm like, how many life events can I really hit in a way that's engaging enough for the reader and doesn't have me rambling for page after page? So I was a little worried about that. Obviously, reader engagement with 18th century writings. If I'm not grading the readers and they don't have to read it, how will I bring them into these writings? I mean, Whitefield, every other sentence was a Bible verse. So I like how can I get enough of these writings and find the pieces of these writings that would be really interesting. A balance as a scholar and an educator and as a Christian. I had my scholar hat on, I had my teacher hat on, but I also am a Christian, and I do follow Jesus myself, so it's not an academic topic for me. I want, my heart and my own passion to be in it as well. Making Whitefield relevant, of course. He's an English guy from the 1700s, a minister, so, that's hard. And then a couple of things I've already mentioned, trying to write in a way that people are encouraged to apply things, so keeping in mind a real practical approach throughout. And then, like I also mentioned, offering balance and evaluating his life and his ministry. So what are the odds? I don't know. Is it possible? Some of you who have done this already, words of wisdom before I launch into the actual chapters, or things you've learned. All right, well, let's see. Strap in. Yeah, I'm going through each chapter, sorry. It's gonna be fast, and I'm almost done. It's gonna be fast. Okay, I just want you to see what the pieces are. I'm gonna show you the 8 questions that I kind of asked myself, the 8 life events that I put in the book, and then the 8 writings. So just so you get kind of a big picture. How to ignite passion for God was where I thought I really had to start. I wanted to look at Whitefield's conversion experience because that's where he got his passion. And he wrote a lot about it in his autobiography, and he even went back and referred to it again later. So it was an impactful time for him. What I ended up using was one of his autobiographies, the first one that he published that just took his life up to his ordination. So I've got an excerpt in there that just talks about what he experienced and how he kind of worked through the process of deciding he wanted to be a Christian. For purpose, I wanted to ask the question of just how do we live a life of meaning? Just because someone is on a spiritual journey doesn't mean that we necessarily feel like we have purpose or kind of a goal or a calling. Whitefield dug in on this. That time of reflection before ordination, he leaned into a couple things that would actually end up being really prominent in his ministry. One was ecumenicalism. He was very open to connecting with other denominations when that was not a thing. And he talks about that even during the process of thinking about ordination. The idea of the new birth, he felt very strongly. He didn't want to just preach to people to just go through the motions spiritually. He really wanted to share about a heart change and something that mattered in the heart. That came out during his time of ordination. So as he kind of worked through his own purpose and calling, he ended up with a lot of really key pieces that would be a part of his ministry. And so I decided to print an excerpt of his first sermon, which according to one writer, drove 7 people mad or something? I don't know. He was real popular from day one, real popular. So that's in the 2nd chapter. I wanted to talk about foundation. There was a lot of things Whitefield could have based his life on. He was very popular. He had a good network. He was successful. He was an ordained minister. But he really didn't build his life on that. He really based it. His foundation really was his one-on-one relationship with God. So that's what I wanted to look at. And he really strengthened and talked a lot about that during his 11 weeks stuck at sea. Maybe that would make anyone turn to God. I mean, that's possible. But he really leaned in his journal about how he wanted to set a firm foundation of him and God so that when things came at him, he would hold on to what he felt was his true passion. So I looked at a lot of his journals there. He thought a lot about daily lifestyle choices. He really felt that as a Christian and as a minister, he should act in a way that showed that. So I decided to look at his 6-week preaching tour of New England. New England was what I called for him batting in the big leagues. It was the most religious area of America. They had been following Whitefield for years, literally through the papers. They had been writing to him. Some of the ministers had more ministers per capita in New England than anywhere else in the world. So when he went there, the stakes were high. And so I looked at that as, okay, what kind of lifestyle choices did he make when he traveled through New England? I looked at his journal to do that. As far as creating connections, I thought it was real fertile ground with Whitefield because he connected with a lot of people, especially his first few months in the Mid-Atlantic. He made some really good friends there, people who ended up being lifelong friends. And for this one, I decided to print an excerpt of the sermon that he wrote and preached right in Philadelphia just a month or so after he made all these friends. I felt like they had really impacted him and that we saw it in his sermon that he wrote. So that's chapter 5. He faced a lot of opposition. This chapter actually looks at pushback from other people within the church, not from outside the church. So he had questions like, buddy, you're pushing this a little too far, and, why are you talking about some of these topics? We're just going to church and we're happy. Like, let's just let it lie, okay? So he had a lot of opposition that way throughout the colonies, really. And for this one, there was a group of Presbyterians in the Mid-Atlantic who took a bunch of his sermons and his journals and just pulled out little phrases and wrote this it was like 60 or 70 page document, just like listing the phrases and everything they thought was wrong with it. And, he's 24 years old. I mean, that's tough to have happen to you, and he's well, it's public. Like, they didn't have social media, but he was in every newspaper. Okay, so people knew about it. So I looked at an excerpt of a letter that he wrote back to them. It was an open letter. It was a public letter, and he's really gentle. He actually admits a lot of that, pretty much everything they said, not pretty much everything, but there were little things he could have been clearer about. He even offers in that letter, here's some other things that I want to correct in the next edition of my sermon. So he was pretty gentle with his response. He wasn't always that way when it came to opposition, but that one I thought was interesting to show one good approach. Responding to culture just had me look at kind of how he responded to the culture around him, how he treated the people, how he felt about some of the issues of the times. And he did write a letter to the inhabitants of Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina on how they treated the enslaved populations among them. And he was the only real revivalist to speak out on that. It was an open letter after he had traveled through the South, and he was very upset with how they treated the enslaved workers, how they withheld Christianity often from them. So he spoke very clearly on that in this letter. And then lastly, how do we maintain our spiritual journey over a lifetime? If spirituality is important to us, it's usually not something we want to lose, but like anything, we can get distracted, things can happen. So I wanted to look at Whitefield's 6-week journey home. That was better than 11 weeks. After he finished his preaching tour, he was heading to some tough things in England. He had some loans that were coming due on the orphanage he had founded in Georgia. There had been a lot of division among people who had initially supported him. There had been a lot of fights over theology and things like that. So he was coming into a kind of tough spot. So I looked at a lot of his journals during that voyage, but then I decided to end the chapter with his last sermon preached in England. So I kind of jump forward like 30 years at the end of this chapter and say, hey, where was he at the end? Include some excerpts of his sermon. This was preached 1 year before he died. It was his last sermon preached in England, and then he left for America and died in America. And it's funny because he references a lot of the things earlier in his life and throughout his life that had been impactful. So that's kind of the structure, kind of what I offered, the different pieces. A couple surprises I found along the way. What kind of voices should be in the book in terms of what people are experiencing as a reader? I mean, I'm a professor, so I want mine in there. Why am I writing this book? Okay, I don't mean that. I also wanted Whitfield's, of course. But my biggest question came around secondary sources. There's a lot of notes, footnotes in the book, because I did really want to bring a lot of historical background. So for most topics that came up, there were other sources that I wanted to refer people to. But I really thought a lot about how many quotes do I bring in from outside people, even if they're really interesting. And I decided actually not to have that many. I decided to put most of that in the footnotes so people can look further into things if they want. The chapter on responding to culture, I brought a lot in, I think a little bit in the introduction. But that was something that I hadn't really thought about when I started writing. I knew I had a lot of pieces, but I was like, okay, what do I do with other scholars who could be of interest? Surprise number 2 was I began to think, is there a way visually to help readers connect to the 18th century? My publisher had the cover designed pretty early. But in talking with them, I was like, can we give something, some images in here so they can get a little picture in their mind? So the publisher actually wanted a bunch of Whitefield images. So there's like 7 or 8 pictures of him at different times in life. I asked about could they include some images of original documents, just to see what a Whitefield handwritten letter looked like or what a journal looked like when it first came out. Because when you see, it's like using anthologies in classes, right? All those writings are divorced from their original form. So I asked them to do that, and they did some images of original documents. And very end, the 11th hour, I'm like, can you put in a map of just, kind of like the one you guys saw, but not that much detail, but just, I realized not everyone grew up on the East Coast like me. So when someone says New York and Boston and Savannah, Georgia, like not everybody has the kind of understanding of the sheer number of miles that he traveled. So anyway, we included that. That was a surprise. And then lastly, this wasn't really a surprise, but going in, I was very aware that I wanted to be circumspect and fair in how I handled Whitfield's failings, because they weren't talked about a lot in a lot of the Christian writings on Whitefield. And I didn't just want to blast the guy, he's human like all of us, but I did want to include them and try to include them in a sensitive way and try to learn from them. Again, the whole goal of this book is not a biography and not just collected writings, but the goal is for us to learn what we can apply in our own spiritual lives. And there were 3 big ones that I knew I wanted to look at. I wanted to look at the extremes during his conversion period. The publisher actually asked me to kind of dig into that, what was healthy and what was unhealthy with how he viewed his own conversion. Also how he managed conflict. I found as I looked at some of the ways he handled opposition, he really grew in that. In the early years, he used his fame and his kind of public, his connection with the public and his platform to publish sometimes like his version of what happened with someone who was opposing him. And of course, the person opposing him didn't have that same platform. So I kind of looked at how he grew in understanding how to manage conflict. And then the largest issue was his attitude about enslavement in the American South. Although he had written that letter in 1740, and although he came out publicly very often saying that actually he did minister to enslaved workers and include them in his meetings and things like that, still 1751, I think, when slavery was made lawful in Georgia, he had the people who were running his orphanage buy an enslaved workforce for his orphanage. So that I felt like I really needed to dig into. Where did that come from? How could a man do one thing like this and then make that choice? So that was one of the biggest issues that I wanted to read about and talk through with the reader about what we can learn from something like that. So that's, I think, about that. Oh yeah, there was one thing I wanted to close with. This is maybe self-serving, I'm sorry. But I did get one email from an endorser that just so sweetly kind of summarized what I was trying to do. He said, the book was honestly not what I expected and was pleasantly surprised. As an academic currently serving in the church, this book represents everything I'm trying to sneak to my congregation. Sneak because my church has a strong anti-intellectual bias, which has at times caused me to wonder why they hired me. This is an important bridge that people like my congregation need. And that's what I was really going for. I had just everyday Christians in mind, myself, in mind. A lot of my family's still on the East Coast, so while I was writing this, I was, going around all these different churches where Whitefield had preached, dragging my son. That's why Whitefield's up here. This can be made for you in the Genesis lab at Payson Library. My son, who's a computer engineer, he was a computer engineering major, he just graduated. He had to take a John Wesley 3D thing and turn it into Whitefield. But that can be made for you at the Payson Genesis lab. But I had these congregations in my mind, these people who were just interested to hear about Whitefield in a way that they could access and in a way that would inspire them. So I got this and I'm like, all right, man, at least one person is thinking I got some of that done. So that was my hope, and I think those of you who have done writing projects or any kind of projects, we all know that we just kind of let it out into the world and we do our best. So anyway, thank you. I appreciate you listening to all of that, and I'm happy to open it up for any questions or anything like that. Any suggestions? Thank you.